All right, now we have part two of what to test and where to test it. Uh, and I found a new marker, which is nice. Okay, so this is basically over the overall picture in Rails. And I have to say, like when I started trying to figure out testing in Rails, I was sort of overwhelmed. So much stuff, feels like it's all over the place. And we've got all these different tests. We have system tests, we have controller tests, we have model tests and unit tests, and oh yeah, what are we supposed to do? So it's like this big system, and we have all these tests, and the tests test different stuff, and like, what should I test where? So here we are. We've just talked about Sandy Metz's notion of if we're dealing with a single object, what should we test? So again, the big thing is we're definitely not testing any of the private methods. We're testing our incoming calls, and we test our outgoing command calls. So that's our unit testing. But the bigger, broader picture in Rails, what is it? What is it that we should be testing and where? So this is largely a review then of all of the testing stuff that we've been talking about at a high level to sort of show you that map again in your mind of where we're testing. So what do we want to test? Well, we do want to test our user workflow that they follow to complete tasks using our system. These we like to call our user stories. So we want to test the user stories. Oh, as a user, I should be able to add a item to the shopping cart. Great. You're going to test that sort of stuff. We're going to test in particular. Be sure we're going to test the happy paths. Okay. So where do we test this sort of thing? This is where we do a system test, also known as an end-to-end or a functional test or whatever. In the case of Rails, this is where we're going to find this. We're going to put these in our test system directory. And the way you're going to be thinking about this is, oh, I'm writing everything in Capybara. You are testing the user interface, okay? You're going to make sure that the user can complete these, and it's the happy paths. You're going to make sure that you test all the happy paths. Absolutely. Oh, as a user, I should be able to do this. And a happy path is assuming I put in the right stuff to do it, okay? So great. Got to test all that stuff. So we do test this. This is where we do the testing. Next, what do we test? Well, we should also test that we do display our important user interface notices or other elements that we want to see in the user interface. So for an example, you're going to basically, you have this question in your mind, which is, do you display error notices on a form submission? Now, I'm not saying test every single error message. So you know that a form, it's got 10 fields, and each of those has a validation or two on them. Before you know it, the combinations of potential errors and inputs is astronomical. You're never going to test all those combinations. With regard to testing the validations, yeah, you'll test the validations, but again, we're going to test those at the model level. So at the user interface, what we're actually really concerned about is, look, if I make a mistake and I'm supposed to display a message that says, so I'm as a user, I make a mistake, and I'm supposed to, the system's supposed to display a message that says, I'm sorry, an email is required to submit the form. Well, do I display that message? And if I display that message, because of the way I've written the code, which is a standard way of displaying all the error messages that are produced, through the validation process, so long as that one gets displayed, I should be able to trust that all the others get displayed as well. It's not a promise and a guarantee that they all work, but that's the level that's sufficient of testing the user interfaces. I want to be sure that if I do a form incorrectly, an error message does show up. And so you could test one of those sort of sad paths. Oh, the user puts in some bad data. Do I get an error message displayed on the screen? If so, I'll assume that all my other validations show error messages too. Don't waste your time with testing every single little tiny bit of all of those error messages. If you really wanted to test, again, all the messages, you could just go check and do your validations and do that at the unit testing level, not at the system level. But again, this, because you're doing the user interface, has to be a system test. Okay, so you've written these tests. Just make a small modification for error. Make sure the error gets displayed. Good, great. The other thing is, I said here, or elements. So you might have things that the client very much is like, I wanted to see it says this. So for example, I want it to say, hello, whatever the user's name is. All right, and it's a really important thing. It's part of the user acceptance criteria. It's in the user interface. Write yourself a system test to see that, yeah, I created a new user. The user has a name, Mark. And then when I go to this page, I see that it displays, hello, Mark. Done. You've written your test. You're done. You're over. But you're not going to test every single thing in the user interface and everything is exactly this way or that way. That'll be extremely brittle. The moment someone goes in and changes one thing in the user interface, you're going to get a ton of tests that just say, I'm all wrong now. And why were you testing for that? Unless it really was a user acceptance criteria that the user interface have exactly this thing in it, don't test it. Okay? The user interface needs to be able to allow some change to it. We don't want to tie lots of tests to it. We want to tie the tests that we have to tie to it, okay? But beyond that, let's not do any additional testing of it. All right, what else? I think a really big thing for our web apps, and definitely something that you should test because it really burns you when it doesn't work. So again, we'll make permanent columns here, what and where. So what I think you should definitely be testing the correct navigation path that exists in the system. And this is in the user interface. And so you're testing that links work. And these are system tests. It's really easy for someone to botch up the user interface and leave out a link or break a link. And we're not going to know that the link is broken until some user tries to click on it and they get a 404 message back saying that doesn't exist. So, and the links are really simple to test. It's kind of like a workflow, but it's basically saying a user should be able to get from this page to that page, this page to this page. Boom. And a beautiful thing to be able to be like, I know that I can do all those navigations. I run the test. They run really fast. I haven't broken any of those links. That's a definite part of the user interface that's sort of critical functionality that should be tested. All right. Now, what about the following? Our routes. Okay. Well, so we want to test, we certainly want to be able to test that requests are routed correctly and responded to correctly, which basically means, what does this mean? This means that we end up at a correct URL. Did we get where we expected to be? Or redirected to a certain URL. Basically, you can write tests for routes and try to isolate and only test the routes. There's a way to do it. I actually think from everything I've read, and I can tell in using Rails, that basically what we're going to, the reality is that what we're really doing here is we're making sure that everything in the controller, so all the controller paths have been tested. So how do we go about doing that? Well, this is where we go ahead and we do our controller tests. And our controller tests, again, in the modern Rails 6, as opposed to the older ones, and you might see some lingering literature out there. These are all action dispatch integration tests. And we've got a whole lecture about doing controller tests. And the reality is, again, if you test your controller, you're testing all these routes. But likewise, it's really what you can really just do. You just type Rails routes, and you see all those routes there. And as you add a new route to the system, you can very easily go ahead and write a controller test, because again, the controller test is written in the form that matches what you see in Rails route. You're going to write, I'm going to write a GET request to this URL, okay, and then it's supposed to be handled by this controller. So basically, everything that you see that you've put into your routes table, and to see them expanded rather than just like resources and stuff, type Rails routes. So again, this really is, you're really looking to see Rails routes. So you run this command, you see all those routes that you have in the system, and you should have a test for at least one test for every single one of those routes, to see that when you have a request of a get, a post, a patch, a delete to that URL of matching that pattern, that controller action is actually called, and then that controller action appropriately responds to it. You get a nice 200 success code, or you've done a 302, a redirect. That's really, and you will be doing your controller tests then at the same time. All right, pretty good. Now, great, I like that. What else? Well, we're sort of working from outside in. We're going from what are the system tests to which are these whole end-to-end tests, to these integration tests, which we also call controller paths. You want to test often. We're writing all these CRUD apps, these apps that have a database on the back end. They create, they read, they update, they destroy elements, those resources in there. And so we do want to test that we have creation and deletion of resources. And when we test them, we want to be sure that at a minimum that we check that they change the count in the database. All right, that's a pretty simple thing. So if I said to create an object, I should really actually see the count go up. Where do we test this? Let's test this at the controller level. And we saw that in the lecture on the controllers. When we're doing these creations and the deletes, we have an assert difference, and we're checking to see that the count changes. Great. Almost all of your applications are going to have a need for authentication and authorization for various parts of the system. And these are all at the level of these requests that come in. So you're going to end up, remember, you've got your routes. People can make a get to this, a post to this, and so forth and so on. And at your controller level, you have things like, verify that the person's logged in. I'll verify that this user is, make sure the user is authenticated. Once I know the user is authenticated, let's make sure that they're authorized to do this action. So where is all this being checked? You're going to check this again. This is all in your controller test, because that's where you are actually checking out this sort of things. This my point. My point being is that when we make these apps, anyone can drive the application via HTTP requests. And you're like, yeah, of course they can, Mark. No. The point is, don't think that hiding the user interface is safe. So you might very well you might say, oh, I have this page here. So let's say it's on the creation of something. And so you've got a GET request to a page that gives you the form. So this is like the new controller method. And so you say, oh, well, only administrators are allowed to have access to the page that gives you the form, displays the form for you so that you can create objects. And then you, on the page for posting that form, don't bother to actually do authentication and authorization. Let's say you basically make a mistake, but you don't do it because you're like, well, how could anyone ever post to it if they can't actually access the form that gets created? Well, remember, everything in your system is just being driven via these HTTP calls. The fact that there's a web browser out there for a lot of people doesn't change the fact that the hackers out there know how to drive your web application directly with HTTP requests. So they're going to probe and they're going to look to find out, did you do something stupid like think just because you won't give me a form, you think that I can't actually submit data to your app at some other URL. Don't fall for that. Anything, it's at the request level. So again, run Rails routes. Look at those routes. For each one of those routes, does someone need to be authenticated? Does someone need to be authorized to do that action on the system? If so, those sorts of things, the authentication and authorization, should be part of your controller tests. You shouldn't just write a controller test for the creation of objects and ignore testing, well, was I able to create the object if I wasn't authorized? You should actually have a test that's like, I attempted to create an object and I wasn't authorized and it failed, okay? That's the reality. If you don't do that, because what happens is without that test being there to check to make sure that the request fails or gets redirected when you're not authorized to do something, when someone, let's say you had written the code correctly, when someone goes in and modifies the controller and they basically remove the check, they screw up, they remove the check for the authorization. If you don't have a test sitting there that when run will say, wait a second, I just detected that I was able to create objects in the resources in the system and I wasn't authorized, oh, this test fails. That change will not be detected. That person will have been able to introduce a bug into the system. You will not catch the actual regression. So the test has to be there to catch the regressions. All right. Oh, that's pretty good. Largely what we've covered system and controller. And again, the controller largely is driven by looking at what you see all the requests coming in and checking is the correct controller action behavior happening on those requests. All right, what else should we be testing? Well, we've already covered this. We should be testing the individual public methods on our models. as well as any other classes or objects. For example, you might put these in the library directory, the lib directory. Where are you going to test this? You're going to write unit tests, and you're going to put them in the models directory. Okay. What's the other really big thing to test? So you got these. Oh yeah, I did all these def. Hey, I defined these methods. Oh yeah, I should test these, and these are public methods, so I'm going to test them. Great, you're going to test them. But then you create a whole bunch of methods through the simple notion of adding a validation. And I think from experience, the complex validations, even the simple ones, you can have a typo. You think it should be validating, but in fact, you created a validation for something that doesn't really exist and matter, and the actual thing never gets validated on the model. And because validations are related to maintaining the integrity of the data in our system, they are really very important I actually think, to be tested. You'll see some people out there say that you shouldn't bother. I think you should. You're going to test your validations with unit tests. Be careful when writing these tests. It's pretty simple to write a test and you say, oh, this should be invalid object because I gave it, like, let's say, incorrect email. If you should make sure that when you give it a correct email, it is valid. I've seen people write tests where they're creating an invalid object because they're leaving off or having an incorrect password, a missing password confirmation. So the object's going to be invalid because of something else. They think they're testing it because it's got an invalid email, but the object itself is absolutely already invalid. One way to do this is, so you create a new object, fill it with valid data, all right? So this isn't create it and store it in the database. This is make it a new object, set its values, so it's still in memory, it hasn't been persisted to the database, assert that it should be valid. All right, now go change that email to the invalid email, and now assert that it's no longer valid. It won't pass the validations. That way I started with it in a valid state, I changed something, now it's in an invalid state. Don't just assume that you already made it and it was in a valid state. You need to check that assumption, that belief. Otherwise, you could just be, it's like, yeah, well, I already said that. You're testing. You're not really testing something. You got to make sure the tests actually test what they say they're going to be testing. All right, that basically covers what to test and where to test it. You focus on those things and you will have in my opinion, a very well-tested web application. So let's just give it a high-level summary again. So the user interface. We only bother to test the user interface with our system tests. Okay? Don't be testing the user interface elements in all of your controller tests. All right? This is with the caveat that the error conditions on our forms are tested in detail via the validations in the unit tests that we do. So we don't need to check all those things at the user interface because we're going to check our validations. And because we were using these form mechanisms that say, yep, I'm working with a model. Now, if you've got some other way of dealing with detecting and reporting error conditions, you got to be sure that you've checked that somehow and dealt with it. you know, this whenever we're going from page to page in our web app, or completing some task. So these various workflows that we do. This is at the system level. Don't do it with the controller tests. Actually do it with the system tests to actually engage that user interface. Because the controller tests, we're not testing the user interface there. We're not going to be testing the views. We want to be sure that they're actually rendering and not having errors. So when we're going from page to page and we're doing a workflow, it's a system test. So all other tests are these single request tests. So this is a request after a request after a request. We're having lots of gets and posts and gets and posts, and we're checking to see that the sequence can flow and work. But if we just want to test a get request, if we just want to test a post request to a certain URL, that's a controller test. So all our tests are single request. So those are our controller. Or we're testing single methods. Well, when we're testing a single method, that's our unit testing, okay? Now you might think, oh, well, we're testing a controller as a single method, but again, because controller, where they're embedded in this huge Rails system, they're integration tests. So when we have an HTTP request and we need to test it, it's a controller test. When we're testing the individual methods, we're going to be testing at the unit level. To get to the controller method that we want to test, we have to send in the HTTP request. Okay. Continuing our summary. I've already said it, but I'll write it on the board. Don't test the view in the controller. Why? The view is the user interface, and that means it's a system test. Test the user interface at the system level. Okay. This sets you up nicely for being prepared for when you work on in future life. You're going to work with fancier web apps that have JavaScript and other things. They have to actually be tested at the user interface, the browser level. So you need to get in the habit that it's in the user interface. I'm going to be writing tests at the system level for that. And just a final summary is that models, what we do is we unit test them. And we also include the validations as part of that. All right. You don't have to test that associations exist and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure the associations will get tested by the rest of the system and all the other calls and stuff. But the validations live on their own, and we need to test that they actually work, because we're not going to bother to test those all the validations at the user interface level. It's certainly not being tested we're not going to bother to test all of them at the controller level. We're going to test that down at the unit test level. All right, so that's basically the idea of what to test and where to test it in Rails.